descendant of Kotlian. And I do hope you can hear me. I just heard someone about recording in progress. Okay.
Yeah,
At
just
any rate, without further ado, let me get on with my talk so that uh, you know what it is I'm talking about. My talk tonight is called Drawn from the Past, Reflections of an Historical Illustrator. Just what historical illustrators do and how they do it is not widely understood, even though their work is often seen in uh, museums, publications, online. Um, Historical illustration is a way to help others to see the past as it may once have looked. But while historical illustration does involve the artist's imagination, far more it requires the artist to understand and interpret data. This means problem solving, and sometimes the solutions an historical illustrator reaches can be applied to the research of others, as I hope to show you tonight. This is a scene from what is now Silicon Valley, a town called Milpitas, and you can see what it looked like in my painting and what it looked like today. Um, because historical illustrators are asked to create believable images, I think this thing is on automatic advance. Because historical illustrators are asked to create believable images of things we cannot see, since they no longer exist, we sometimes turn to models. Models are used to solve problems of anatomy, scale, perspective, viewpoint, and representing light and shadows. Models can be physical, made of cardboard, plastic, etc., but increasingly they are digital. As an historical illustrator working on deadlines, I increasingly use digital models, and this is why. To pose something like this with live models, horses, getting the action perspective correct would be time consuming and expensive. So digital models are very useful, but sometimes I need to work out certain problems in 3 dimensions in order to understand how something worked. For example, last year I was hired by Schreiner University in Texas to reconstruct for a documentary the appearances of some of the Spaniards and Native Americans who clashed there in the mid 1700s, resulting in a massacre at the Franciscan mission of San Saba, northwest of San Antonio in 1758. I knew even before I accepted the project that this period was not well known, that no one had ever really created truly evidence based reconstructions of these subjects. I also knew that for me, the Spaniards would be the easiest part, since I have researched and illustrated their dress and accoutrements for many previous projects, as Jim let you know. And so here's what I created for the Shriner project as far as the Spanish went: Presidio officers and a soldier wearing a leather jacket, or a type called a cuera. He was called a soldado de cuera. The real challenge I knew would be in reconstructing the appearance of the Southern Plains warriors who took part in this conflict. That's because the popular idea of how Plains Indians went to war, the one built by generations of authors, artists, movies, and television, doesn't really apply to the mid 1700s. And if you see me flashing back and forth over these slides, it's because somehow this slide, this slideshow is on automatic advance. So I'm going to have to do this as I go. I apologize. I knew this because many years ago I read this article, Changing Military Patterns of the Plains Indians by Secoy. Briefly, the idea is that horses and guns entered the Great Plains separately and from different directions. In the American Southwest, horses became important in indigenous cultures, for warfare in particular, long before there were guns available. This was the post-horse, pre-gun period described by the author. In such conditions, there emerged a class of warriors who not only armored themselves against enemy arrows, but also their horses. Based on a description of the Paducah, believed to be Lipan Apache warriors, I created this reconstruction. The quote was from the Ponca, an oral history taken in the 19th century, and the informant said, the Paducah, to protect their horses from arrows, made a covering for the horses' breasts and side. This covering was made of thick rawhide cut in round pieces and made to overlap like the scales of a fish. Over the surface was sand held on by glue. The Paducah protected their own bodies by long shields of rawhide. Some of them had breastplates made like those on their horses. Now, years ago, I took that description and made this drawing, which was pretty good for its time, but I've since learned that it's out of date. Um, I know this because a while back I talked with Dr. James Kaiser, Jim, who kindly introduced me just now. Jim wrote to me about Spanish saddles, as he told you, in the American West, and I learned from him about the remarkable advances in our understanding of Plains Indian horse armor based on rock art and other sources. So when this project with Schreiner University came along, I contacted Jim and he brought me up to date on the work that he and his colleagues have done in the field of Plains Indian rock art. A separate foundational strand of evidence for understanding Plains Indian horse armor was, of course, the Segesser hide paintings. This is one of three long paintings on buffalo hide. Only two survive, unfortunately. And this one here was cut up in order to make wallpaper for a chateau in Switzerland. And these were acquired by a Jesuit priest, Philip von Segesser von Brunnig, in 1758. In the late 20th century, they were acquired by the New Mexico History Museum in Santa Fe. And a couple of years ago, at the start of my project with Schreiner University, I took advantage of the opportunity to visit the museum to study the paintings close up. In a way, the Segesser paintings, the second of which tells of the tragic outcome of a Spanish expedition into Nebraska, are the bayou tapestries of early Southwestern military history. There isn't much solid information about Segesser I. It probably dates from the late 1600s to the early 1700s, and most likely represents Spain's northern Mexican Indian allies attacking another unknown tribe, possibly Apaches, we don't know. Now, armor of several kinds, including those made from animal hides, have been worn by Native Americans, tribes from ancient times and all across the continent, though not in all places. These, for example, are Alaskan, Tlingit, but they're similar to those described for 17th and 18th century Plains Indians. When horses were introduced in numbers to the Great Plains in the 17th century, indigenous armor traditions were extended to these valuable animals. And I'm sorry that I didn't include my painting of Katlian that Jim described. It would have been fun. We now understand that horse armor was used on the Great Plains for roughly a century, starting in the 1600s, until eventually it was made obsolete by the widening use of firearms by indigenous people. But the initial model for horse armor, and perhaps the idea, came with the source of these horses, the Spanish conquistadors. And while I'm aware of recent developments pointing to the adoption of horses by Plains Indian tribes even before they encountered the Spanish themselves, that's not quite relevant to this story. And as I will try to show now, it wasn't the sort of armor that the Plains Indians were influenced by in constructing protective coverings for their horses. The earliest known descriptions of Plains Indians using horse armors dates from 1689, about the same time as the Segesser hide painting. It was written by Henri de Tonty, a lieutenant of the French explorer, the Sieur de la Salle, and it describes warriors of the Caddo tribe living on the Red River in eastern Texas. This is a painting, not of the Caddo, but of the Tawakoni tribe that were near relatives to theirs. The same artist who painted them in 1828, Lino Sanchez y Tapia, painted the Caddo, but they were wearing French clothing, so it would have been irrelevant. But the Caddo probably looked pretty much like this in 1689. Tonty wrote that the Caddo make body coverings of several skins, one over the other, as a protection from arrows. They arm the breasts of their horses with the same material, a proof that they are not very far from the Spaniards. By that, I believe that the proof was the horses, but of course it could also have been the armor. In 1719, the French explorers Claude Charles Dutin and Jean-Baptiste Laharpe found the Wichita and their neighbors on the Arkansas River, or as they pronounce it in Kansas, the Arkansas River in Kansas, protected themselves and their horses in battle with leather armor. I should note here that when I use the word leather in this context, I mean brain tanned skins, not the tanned leather that we are familiar with. 5 years later, in 1724, Etienne de Vignard, Sieur de Bourgmont, encountered with the Paducah, the Apaches in Kansas, and noted that specially tanned buffalo skins with which they protect themselves, adding that they also hang them around their horses to protect them against arrows. And just in case you can't quite believe that there's someone underneath all that armor, I gave you my drawing as a kind of X-ray to show you that, yes, it actually could work. As late as 1805, Lewis and Clark wrote of the Lemhi Shoshone that they met with on their way to the Pacific that they have a kind of armor like a coat of mail, which is formed of a great many folds of dressed antelope skins, united by means of a mixture of glue and sand. With this, they cover their own bodies and those of their horses and find it impervious to arrows. Clearly, the Shoshone at this point had not yet received the number of guns that tribes further to their south had already begun to obtain. The painting here is by, of course, the famous Charles Russell, and it would have been very interesting, I think, had Charlie decided to show the armored warriors rather than the ones that he shows here now. But returning to the Segesser One hide painting, I wish to point out two unexpected features. First, the writer sat inside the armor rather than over it, using a kind of kayak hatch in which to get into it, or perhaps it was lowered over them. We don't have any idea of how it was put on. And second, the armor seemed to envelop the horses entirely without openings. Now, I need to make a short detour here into the whole notion of armoring a horse for war. It was not, of course, invented by Native Americans. Horses have been armored for combat since antiquity, as you can see from this drawing from Dura Europus in Syria in about 165 to 256 Common Era. And this tradition probably was common from Europe all across Asia and even into Africa. The materials, construction, and names of all these many different types of horse armor varied over the centuries and different regions. And at this point, I'll mention that I'm going to refer to horse armor in this talk as barding. But they had a few features in common. First, the rider sat over the barding, the horse armor. And isn't it a wonderful modern reenactor? He's representing a cataphract, a heavily armored horseman from Asia Minor during the Roman times, and that armor that he has on his horse is actually based on some that were found at Dura Europus, as I'll show you in a bit. And some people call going to this level to reconstruct the past experimental archaeology, and my apology to you archaeologists there. But I would like to plant a seed by asking you to remember that term, and I'll talk more about that later. Second, in contrast to the Segesser painting, in order to let the horse move freely, the armor usually had breaks in it, whether at the front and sides, that's the Dura Europa armor up above, and to the right is an African armor. The Dura Europa armor is open on the side, on the front and back. The African armor from West Africa is open on the sides. Somehow the horse's legs have got to be able to move, and if it's hanging straight down as you see here, something's got to give, and it's usually either the front and back or on the sides. The other option, in order to allow the horse to be able to run while armored, is to make it short so that it doesn't interfere with the legs at all. These rules, openings on the sides in this case, still apply today, as you can see from these riot police from South America. But Segesser 1 shows the warriors riding inside the barding, and so do all of the Plains Indian rock art. This does seem odd, but it isn't without precedent. Historians have long assumed that the conquistadors of Coronado and later expeditions into the American Southwest all rode over their horse armor, just as European cavalry of the time did. We see here on the portrait of Charles V, he's riding over his horse armor. However, there is a 1580 codex depicting a battle in central Mexico during what is called the Chichimeca War, and it provides evidence that at least some Spanish cavalry had by then adopted the practice of riding inside their horses' bardings. We still don't know when, where, or why this innovation occurred, and I have no idea why it was done. It seemed to have the drawback of confining the rider to the horse, which, should it be wounded or killed, would trap the rider, or so it appears to me. But you should notice also that the Chichimeca era art armor is short. So that was how they were solving the problem of the horse being able to move within inside the barding. Armor like that seen in the Chichimeca map and Sagessa 1 clearly served as prototypes for what the Plains Indians came to use, except for one thing: curved seams. Curved seams were invented in Europe in the 1400s as a result of new fashions for clothing that fit closely to the body. We continue to use them today, of course, and yet they were not used anywhere else in the world until they were introduced by Europeans. Now, of course, they're so universal that no one thinks what a remarkable invention they are. And anyone there tonight wearing jeans, you're all wearing curved seams to fit your body. Um, so the curved seams uh, would make the Sagessa armor fit smoothly over the horse's rump and could have held the armor out far enough in front and rear to allow the horse to move, maybe even to run. Note that the Mughal horse armor achieves a similar shape with reinforcing of some sort. This might be the case with the Sagessa armor, especially when you see how the hatch the rider sits in is formed with a hoop, but we have no way of knowing. You would want the armor, which was long, to stand out away from the horse in front and back so that they could run or at least trot, since they are shown leading the charge in the Sagessa painting. But as horse armor spread onto the Great Plains, it was adopted by tribes that did not use curved seams. Moreover, they made the armor so long that often the hooves on the horse don't show in some pictures. This makes one form of barding seen in Plains art, a rock art, look, at least to me, like a pup tent, a pup tent with a head. We see this shape repeated. And yes, for the purpose of this talk, I will call this pup tent horse armor. To better understand how this full-length pup tent type of armor looked and functioned, I turned to making a physical model using leather and a toy horse. And yes, it is embarrassing to admit that at my time of life, I began playing with toy horses and making little clothes for them. But it did help me to reach some conclusions about the pup tent armor. Even after making this crude model, I still had questions, and with encouragement from Jim Kaiser, I decided to get serious. To make the pattern, I followed Jim Kaiser's advice to believe the artwork, which is most likely made by men who actually saw or even used this kind of armor. But the drawings vary, and I had to reach some kind of average shape and then scale that to match my first model horse. So I made the armor somewhat symmetrical, a symmetrical triangle with a flattened top. I also reasoned that the barding was supported by the saddle beneath. That way it could reach up to the rider's waist and protect him. Um, this drawing on the lower right seems to confirm that the armor was indeed at least held up partly by the saddle. So I started with the outline of a horse, and then I applied the actually quite symmetrical shape that I drew here, and tried it. And that's Comanche saddle on the lower right to give you an idea of what it might look like supporting the armor. Um, I'm not going to show you what happened with this thing. I tried this shape out on my horse model, and it just didn't work. Possibly because it was held up in the center by the saddle. It tended to curve in the middle upward, and it just didn't work. And then I thought a bit. Uh, I realized that Plains Indians didn't use curved seams. While they didn't use curved seams, they did create curved edges when constructing with hides, most especially the teepee and its fittings. With these, they were able to fit flat cones flat hides to a cone. So with that in mind, I started over. What I discovered is that when you construct horse bardings in this way, they begin to show some of the same characteristics we see in the rock art, such as the slight curve at the bottom on the rear edge. The back of the armor is somewhat longer than the front. After trying it on my horse model first in paper, then in some scrap cloth, I made a model barding from some soft suede leather. And here are a couple more views. I still think it looks like a pup tent with a head. I decided to make the neck armor as well and found that it was easiest to lace it up the back of the neck, which also makes sense because lacing beneath the neck could gap and leave a target. And I do think it was laced in most cases, though it might have been just a tube. I don't picture that it would be very easy to fit that over a horse's head. Um, Also, it would have to be reasonably flexible so that the horse could raise and lower and turn side to side with its neck. One thing that did surprise me after I constructed this barding was just how much legroom there was beneath the armor. After trying it on my standing horse, I tried it on my running horse. Surprisingly, it appears that the armor left enough room for the horse to move, maybe even to gallop. But there still would have been drawbacks to armor of this shape. First of all, with its length, it would drag on the ground quite a lot. Um, it would have made crossing a stream pretty messy. Um, in a strong wind, it might even have slowed you down or turned your horse to one side. Uh, I suspect that such armor as this was probably put on the horse immediately before going into battle and taken right off right after, because while it may not have slowed the horse down as I once thought it would, I think it would have probably been very inconvenient. At any rate, I should also mention that I didn't make any attempt in making these models to copy how or to figure out how the flat hides were shaped into the armor itself. What I really needed to know was how well a horse could move in this pup tent. Um, and I should also note that the armor that some about this armor that some observers had described it as made up of layers of of hide sandwiched with glue and sand, or with rawhide scales attached. And both of those would have made the armor stiffer and might have slowed the horse down. But I don't believe this armor would have been particularly heavy. Brain tanned hides are much lighter than tanned leather. And still, Jim Kaiser has likened this kind of armored warrior and horse combination to tanks acting as shock forces. And about that, I think he's quite right. However, after thinking about it a bit, and I'm just speculating here, I have to wonder just how long that trick would work. First, I think this armor would work best against dismounted opponents, those who had no horses, and this seems to be supported by the artwork. But the shock effect of a man on a horse mostly covered in armor that was proof against arrows might have functioned once or twice to dismay the enemy, but eventually someone would figure out that an arrow shot at the rider's head or his horse's head would render the rest of their protections pretty irrelevant. And it is still an open question just how fast and nimble a horse covered over to this extent would be. Now, it surprises me that there is no evidence that the armored warriors carried bows and arrows, but I'm assured that they did not. And they're not seen in the artwork nor mentioned in descriptions. Yet armored horsemen around the world have traditionally been archers, so there is no reason why they couldn't have carried bows and arrows if they wished. However, again, I admit that there's no evidence that they did. But if they didn't carry bows and arrows, perhaps they brought backup, mounted archers whose horses were not armored, something like the escort fighters around a World War II bomber. And Suggestion 1 shows just that. Of the 9 attacking cavalrymen, only 2 are armored, and they are in the lead. The rest wear personal armor, but nothing on their horses. Several of them are armed with bows and arrows. Warriors on unarmored horses also appear in early rock art, and I'm going to have to open myself up to criticism on this one because I don't know which of these actually might date from as early as 1650 to 1750. Uh, but none of these horses, at any rate, are armored because you can see their tails. Warriors on, uh, so even before, um, oh, and I should mention that I think that any warrior who was armored completely with the horse armor and all, probably both seen in the lead here, but also for the expense of this outfit, probably would have been a chief or some kind of important war leader rather than just your average Joe. Even before the introduction of guns to the Great Plains, I believe there would have been incentives to modify the pup tent bardings. In time, all the other tribes began to acquire horses, so the heavily armored shock troops meant to overwhelm and overawe their dismounted opponents became outmoded. There were also still the problems of high winds dragging armor and the difficulty of crossing streams. But on the southern plains, where I'm particularly focused, the danger also was the Spanish, whose cavalry also wore personal armor, multi-layered vests called cueras, but whose horses were unencumbered, and they had swords and sometimes firearms. This is a picture of a soldado de cuera and a Pueblo ally from the other Segesser painting, also in the Museum of New Mexico. And you can see that someone as nimble, but also pretty well armed like this, going up against a horse covered completely with a barding that reached down to the ground, probably would have had something of an advantage. So my theory is, my hypothesis, I should say, is that there was a motive, or many motives, for shortening and lightening the pup tent type armor. And this is what it may have looked like. It would be shorter, and it would be open at least in front to allow your horse's legs to move more freely. And we see just this sort of armor in Plains rock art. Note that on many of these shorter bardings, the front appears curved and often doesn't stand out in front of the horse's chest the way the pup tent armor does. If that shape were sewn, it would have created a bag that had no purpose, but might also have tripped the horse. Keeping in mind that Plains Indians didn't use curved seams, but they did use curved edges to shape the things that they made out of hide, I believe this suggests that the bardings were open partway up the front and the edges rounded back to lessen flapping. I'm sorry, to lessen flapping. So now I have to make a shortened, a modified version. I took the same pattern that I had used before and I simply cut it up. I cut it up higher and I curved the front and I left it partly open. Now, I should emphasize that I do not know that these shortened open-fronted bardings came after or replaced the pup tent sort, though it does seem likely to me. I'm not an expert on rock art, and this is my only evidence. So here again, I tested it in paper, tried it in cloth, and made it up in leather, and it looks something like this. And you can compare it with the drawing there to see where the curve is. I've actually made mine slightly longer than the one that you see in the drawing on the right, probably because there are some that show them below the horse's knees and back legs. Um, but one way or the other, I already know this would work. I tried it on the standing horse, and here's a couple more views of what that might look like. And then I tried it on the running horse, and it worked like a dream. Uh, the guy could really move around if he was armored like this. So this is how I represented the Comanches in my artwork for Schreiner University. Uh, Now I have constructed them here because I had to in parallel lines because that seems to be suggested by the rock art. I don't know that was how they constructed things. Teepee liners are sometimes constructed in a similar way, but it's just as likely that they use overlapping hides the way they did when they made teepees. I just don't know, and I don't think there's any way to know at this point. Relatively recently, though, I learned about the Verde Vista drawings in New Mexico, which I believe are a relatively recent discovery. And Jim tells me that the jury is still out on these drawings. But recent scholarship has tended to identify these as Comanche in New Mexico and 18th century. Um, I have to say, when I looked at the photograph of what the drawings actually looked like in situ, I can't make heads or tail of them. So I'm amazed that someone could do something as detailed as this drawing from them. Be that as it may, taking this as, possibly that's what it actually shows, it might represent a further evolution of the horse barding uh, of the Plains Indians. Note that you can see the horses' tails, you can see their feet coming out the front of the armor. It could be that this is a much reduced and lightened armor, which might make sense because these are the Comanches in New Mexico, and as I said, they would be meeting up with the Spanish at this point. However, these shortened bardings are rather reminiscent of a painting that was actually done following the massacre at San Sabah for the brother of one of the priests who died there. Now, this was not done by an eyewitness, but we know that the artist must have worked from eyewitness descriptions. And the reason I know that is that the one priest who survived the massacre, there were four priests there and only one survived. He later wrote, the Spanish were incredible record keepers, and they interviewed all the survivors and made triplicate copies and filed them around away in archives. And the priest who survived actually wrote that he met one of the Comanche chiefs just before the killing began, and the chief was wearing a red coat. Well, what do we see on the right hand side but a chief wearing a red coat? So I feel that though the artist didn't actually see these people, he worked from the descriptions of someone who had seen them. And so that makes it interesting. Now, again, he shows the writers writing over the bardings. Maybe, probably not. Again, the distance, this painting was done in Mexico City, not in central Texas, thousands of miles away. But nevertheless, it is interesting to see that they too realized that the Indians were still using the armor, even though most of the attackers in the San Sabah massacre were armed with muskets that they had gotten from the French. It was said that only the boys who were too young, the teenage boys who came along and they didn't even have horses, were given bows and arrows. Everyone else had muskets, and good ones from the French. Nevertheless, they still continued to use their armor, possibly as a sign of prestige. I don't know.
Discover maps of time and feel that exhilaration when you finally find the one, a masterpiece for your space. Well, that was me with the unique maps code. Ordered my first map, boom, fast delivery, zero import chaos.
Now I don't know what that is.
Bringing adventures. Trust me, for any map lover, it's a no-brainer.
Something alien out there.
Okay, all right. So I'd like to sum up now what I've done. And to say again that historical illustrators like myself try to recreate the past by making pictures of things that we cannot see because they no longer exist. And that in that work, models are invaluable. And my hope is that sometimes the application can be wider than just my art alone. The models that I created of Plains Indian horse armor were meant to show me how they might look when I painted them. But I think they can also be used to test how they might affect an animal's movements. As a result, I reached one conclusion and a few hypotheses. I concluded that the full-length armor seen in many examples of rock art would have been somewhat restrictive, but less restrictive than I originally thought it would have been. We don't know quite how much, but certainly it would have been inconvenient by dragging on the ground, subject to high winds, and a mess when crossing a stream. Which leads me to my first hypothesis, that the warriors with heavily armored horses served as shock troops against dismounted opponents who mostly appear to be without horses. Those same opponents might have adapted quickly and learned to fight back, the simplest way being to aim arrows or even rocks at a warrior or his horse's head. Which is why my second hypothesis is that these riders on armored horses were elite, not average warriors, probably chiefs, and that this idea is supported by the existence in the art of this era of non-armored cavalry and of lightly armored backup, armed in part with bows and arrows. My third hypothesis is to propose that some sort of inherent drawbacks of the pup tent form of barding, dragging, aerodynamics, possibly limiting the free movement of the horse, led to a modified type of armor, and that the modified armor is seen in the shorter barding of some rock art, and that most of these have rounded fronts that can only be explained, I believe, as a sign that they were partly open in front and that the corners were rounded off. But I also freely admit that I don't know that drawings of the modified bardings date from after the pup tent type, only that it seems likely to me. And this brings me to my final point. I ask you to remember the idea of experimental archaeology. And my final point is that someone needs to make full-size replicas of the two types of armor from the right materials and then test them on actual horses in this kind of experimental archaeology that I mentioned earlier. Here, for example, again, is our Dura Europus cataphract, and also the rather grand example of a replicated or reconstructed Greek warship, the Olympia, that helped to solve problems of just how these things were rowed and sailed and navigated and many other applications. I think that to do this with horse armor of the Plains Indians would be a way of answering a lot of questions about how effective it was and I don't know what part it played in the tactics of the time and how it might have been might have evolved due to circumstances of the longer type being inconvenient or more expensive or just what. I don't know how many of you might have seen this documentary. It's by Nova PBS, and it was about reconstructing a Egyptian war chariot, and they went all through the process. My one thought is that if anyone did care to reproduce the horse armor, it would make a really dandy documentary that I think that even public television might be interested in. At any rate, that's my conclusion and my hope that it would be great to reconstruct these things larger than my little silly horse models and see just how these things worked. I mean, after all, wouldn't you want to see these things move? I know I would. Thank you. Hello?
Thank you, David.
You're welcome.
Okay. Yeah, thanks very much, David. We have time for a few questions. If anybody in the audience or Zoom land wants to put questions in the chat. Or Rachel.
Is there any evidence of them doing it bareback? Because I'm not
Doing what
overly
bareback?
familiar with Native American
I'm sorry, doing
saddles. Doing it with
do,
bareback, no saddle.
but with the armor?
Yeah.
No, actually, just the opposite. That at least the Spanish observers of this and the French made a point of saying that they were using either Spanish saddles with stirrups underneath all that and Spanish bridles with Spanish bits, which is the way I reconstructed them in my paintings. Um, so no, they were very clear, and that saddles were an integral part of this kind of panoply, that they had to have, that they use saddles.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Questions? Okay, Jim Kaiser.
Yeah, the only rock art picture we have that shows us one way or the other shows a saddle underneath the armor.
Yeah, yeah, I included that one. You're right.
Yeah. Here you go, Corey.
Anyone else? Dennis.
Well, the Indians of the Northwest Coast oftentimes, I've seen in literature, had a garment called a claman that was personal or personnel armor, and it was made of real thick elk hide.
Mm.
Have you ever referenced any information from the Northwest Coast?
Oh my gosh, yes. I mean, I did at the start of my career, one of my great assignments that I love doing was I did paintings for Sitka National Historic Park, and they're still used there. A friend was traveling there, and apparently they're still on display in the museum. And I reconstructed Katliam, the war chief's armor, and I used a lot of that research in understanding the leather armor. I'm afraid my computer battery is running low, so if there are any questions, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to leave soon.
Anybody else want to squeeze in one last question? Okay, Katie.
In your career, have you done any of the technical artifact illustrations?
Yes, yes. As a matter of fact, I'm working on one now for a archaeological dig of slaves' quarters in here in Delaware, reconstructing what the ceramics look like. And I'm also at the same time doing the buildings and fitting them in the landscape, and and then oddly enough, reconstructing how the burials took place that were found at the site. But yes,
Is
I have
that-
done quite a bit of work with the artifacts.
I did a little bit of, I did my master's in England and got introduced to artifact illustration. I was wondering kind of what the market for it was over here in the US.
I don't know. Luckily, I worked for the state government for a number of years, and so I'm retired, and I can pick and choose the illustration assignments that I like, and so it's not really something. Luckily, I'm very grateful that I have to live by, because I'm not sure that historical illustration is all that lucrative a field, but I have to say it is certainly the most enjoyable work that I've ever done.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, great. Another round of applause for David Rickman.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks very much, David.
All right. I'm going to sign off. Goodbye.
Okay, perfect. OAS folks, we'll be back here Tuesday, April 7th. And we will have Ann Stoll giving a presentation, Ancient Visages, Comparing Human Form and Face in Prehistoric Carved Art. Okay, so join us in a month.